Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, President Trump announcing he helped forge what he calls a historic agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates to normalize diplomatic relations. What is the significance, and will it bring us closer to peace in the Middle East? President of Eurasia Group Bremmer shares his insights on what this could mean for the region and details why he refers to this deal as an obvious win for the U.S. And the latest Fox News poll continues to show President Trump trailing presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden. But will Biden's lead last? Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace weighs in. He'll also discuss Congress stalling on a coronavirus stimulus package and the commander-in-chief's ongoing issue with mail-in voting. Plus commentary from Guy Benson, host of The Guy Benson Show. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm David Asman, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, August 14th, 2020. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Is it one step closer to actual peace in the Middle East, or is it a one-off deal with one Gulf nation?
The Middle East, the most dysfunctional region geopolitically in the world. We now see a trend in the opposite direction. How can that not be a win?
I'm Lisa Brady. As the nation counts down to Election Day, what impact will the coronavirus have at the ballot box?
To a certain degree, this is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. How did he handle the coronavirus? How did he handle the economy?
And I'm Guy Benson. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Just how big a deal is this deal?
This is the first time in 25 years that Israel and an Arab country have normalized diplomatic relations and entered into a peace deal.
That's National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien speaking alongside a number of officials in the Oval Office on Thursday surrounding President Trump, who was thrilled about Israel's new bilateral agreement with the United Arab Emirates.
We are already discussing this with other nations, very powerful, very good nations and people that want to see peace in the Middle East.
The outgoing U.S. Special Envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, explained.
Peace between the Arabs and the Israelis is Iran's worst nightmare, and no one has done more to intensify the conflict between Arabs and Israelis than Iran. And what we see today is a new Middle East. The trend lines are very different today.
He said the future is in the Gulf with Israel, that Iran is in the past. The man in front of the negotiations, President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, explained in broad terms how he thinks this came about.
The president, like with all things, urged us to take an untraditional approach. You can't solve problems that have gone unsolved by doing it the same way that people before you have tried and failed. The president takes untraditional approaches. He does things in different ways, but he uses common sense and he tries to unite people by focusing on common interests as opposed to allowing them to focus on their common grievances.
Reaction poured in. The leaders of countries with peace agreements with Israel, Egypt, and Jordan praised the deal, but specifically because it stops, for now, Israeli settlement building in the West Bank, which you'd think the Palestinians would be happy about, but they were not. Hamas called the deal a backstab. Saudi Arabian ally Bahrain praised the deal.
This is the beginning of normalization of relations between Israel and the Gulf states. It is a major breakthrough.
Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group.
And it comes on the back of so many years of so many people writing op-eds saying if there wasn't a peace deal between Israel and Palestine, that we would never have a future for this country. And actually, Israel's in a much stronger position today than they have been historically, despite the fact that the main efforts of Democratic and Republican administrations for decades on the Palestinian issue has come to nothing. But Israel is actually a meaningful ally of the United States, and today is feeling like they are in an increasingly solid geopolitical position in the region.
The Trump administration, namely the president himself, has said he expects more bilateral agreements between Israel and other Gulf nation countries on the heels of this one. And I'm wondering, is this the new way forward in terms of Middle East peace? In other words, we no longer, as you sort of referenced, are doing this setup of, okay, Israelis talk to Palestinians. Now instead we're going to go out to other Gulf nations.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the Palestinian peace plan that was unveiled by Jared and company hadn't even involved the Palestinians in writing it up. When I go and talk to Arabs in the Gulf, whether it's Emiratis or Saudis or Bahrainis or Kuwaitis or Qataris, and I ask them what are the things that worry them the most in the region, Israel-Palestine isn't even on the list. It's Al-Qaeda and it's Iran, it's Yemen, it's Syria, it's Libya. It's the future of the global energy environment when we're moving away from fossil fuels. It's domestic governance. And frankly, Israel is no longer that kind of a problem. In fact, they're potentially a help because they need Israeli technology. They need Israeli surveillance. They need, the ability to diversify their own economies. And I'm not surprised that the Emirates moved first because they're the country in the region that is most oriented towards the 21st century and is most diversified away from their own energy production. So they're diversifying their geopolitics now, too. But I completely believe that in the coming months, there will be other countries in the region that will join. This is not going to be a one-off for the UAE.
The line out of the White House is that, and I think it came from Brian Hook, that these kinds of deals are Iran's worst nightmare. How much are these potential alliances about Iran, and what exactly is Iran doing to push Gulf countries toward Israel?
Well, Iran's in a lot of trouble. They're a kleptocracy themselves. They're increasingly with an unhappy population. Their economy has shrunk by 10% in the last year on the back of U.S. sanctions, and now they've got a badly managed pandemic as well. You remember back in January when we assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of their military, and they were unable to do anything but basically wave a white flag. And the proxies that they have in the region. I mean, Lebanon, Hezbollah. Given the disaster that's befallen Beirut in the last week, that's not going well either. And now they see the Israelis and the Emiratis, two of their top enemies in the region, are making peace. And none of this is good for Iran at all. And very interestingly, you may not have seen, but Vice President Biden just came out with a statement where he was nothing but supportive. In a hyper-politicized election, it is obvious to everyone this is a win for the United States. There was no need to criticize this for politics. Biden was quite smart in not doing so. Everyone should come together and recognize this is a good thing.
Let's talk about briefly the wins, right? Because you see the quotes from people about what this deal means. For example, Israel says, okay, travel back and forth from Tel Aviv to UAE, more Muslims coming to see the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We Israelis agree to suspend and delay any sort of planned annexation or sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria, namely, you can imagine in the West Bank and settlement expansion, right? So when we think of wins, losses, concessions, what are they? and how do they matter to us in the United States?
The Israelis are making no concessions here. The fact that they're holding off on annexation, it was something that 6 months ago they weren't doing. The fact that now you'd be able, the UAE is the most technologically advanced of Gulf countries. They'll not just be traveling, they'll be investing, they'll be trading. They'll be doing business. The biggest problem in the Middle East is the fact that you have a whole bunch of countries that hate each other. And if this is what actually unlocks economic relations, educational relations, cultural relations between countries that had considered themselves deep enemies before, that's obviously a win. When we look around the world right now, we see the United States and China fighting. We see decoupling is what we're talking about, people less economically integrated. The Middle East, the most dysfunctional region geopolitically in the world. We now see a trend in the opposite direction. How can that not be a win?
And Ian, finally, Palestinians are less than pleased. We've seen statements from Hamas and Fatah. They're infuriated, really. What do you expect to come from this? Is there any country in your mind that could bring the Palestinians on board in future talks and future bilateral agreements or whatever?
Look, the deal that they're being offered on the table is less than they got from Clinton. It's less land. It's less desirable land, though there's money attached to it. It's less autonomy. And I mean, anyone objectively that looks at that deal would say, well, why should I take this? I was being offered something else 20 years ago. And the answer is, well, because you're in a much worse position now and people don't care about you. And that the natural human response to that is to be angry. But when you see that actually Israel is not falling apart, in fact, they're moving on with their lives, and meanwhile Palestinians are starving and they have no educational opportunities. I mean, I don't have any illusions that Hamas would be able to would go back to the table, but maybe the Palestinians could get rid of some of the worst people that are representing them, and will vote in new governments that would be willing to engage, even if the outcome is suboptimal.
Many in Israel were not surprised things had been moving in this direction. But as we just talked about with Ian Bremmer, how do things move forward if Palestinians are not on board? We talked to Dr. Nir Boms, research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University.
Every peace deal in the Middle East is important. It is a big deal. This, in some ways, has been coming. We have seen the signs for this. The rapprochement between the two countries. In many ways, some have observed that, if you correctly, that we had degrees of normalization with the UAE and with the Gulf without the peace process, while with countries like Egypt and Jordan, we had peace without normalization. So this is very positive. It certainly is a big deal because it will allow for other things to move. It could be that UAE will be the first and a number of other countries will follow.
But, Doctor, the Palestinians are not on board. I mean, the statements from Hamas and Fatah indicate they feel very strongly this is not in their favor, even with the agreement from Israel to suspend or delay annexation of land in the West Bank. What do you make of their reaction?
Not entirely surprising. When UAE had landed a plane in Ben Gurion airport full with aid to the Palestinians, the PA in that sense chose not to accept it. Partially because it came from UAE and partially because they are still sticking to an anti-normalization line and saying that the only way to move is to not to speak with Israel rather than to engage with Israel, because they think they have no partner and in many ways prove to Israel that there is no partner on the other side. So the Palestinians stick with this particular line, while the UAE is saying, look, with all the respect to the Palestinians, we need to move forward. That's part of the message. Another part of the message, important enough, is saying that the Palestinians are a part of this. If the Palestinian will choose to jump on the bandwagon and jump on the train, it can move with them. If the Palestinian will choose not to and choose to continue with the anti-normalization line, there's a good chance that the train will continue to move without them. They're not entirely happy. They thought that they tried to say to the world that the only way that the Middle East can move and that peace can happen is if Israel will work on the Palestinian problem. The Palestinians are the key for everything else. I think this move shows that that may not be the case.
Do you have any nervousness at the idea of free travel between UAE and Tel Aviv so that Muslims can go pray at Al-Aqsa?
No, I do not have such fear. First of all, there are ways to make arrangements and screen who is coming and who is going. Second, we've had plenty of guests. I hosted personally a number of people from some of these countries, a number of people from countries with whom Israel do not share diplomatic relations. And this is something that I think will only happen more and more. I think the idea of Muslims coming to pray in Al-Aqsa can potentially help make Al-Aqsa what it should be, one of the most important holy places to the Muslims, not just to the Palestinians. And I think some of these perspectives may again bring some fresh ideas onto the table of how do we solve the disputes that we have in the region.
Dr. Nir Boms, thank you so much for your time.
You're more than welcome. Happy to be here.
This is Guy Benson with your Fox News commentary coming up.
President Trump comes out swinging after his Democratic challenger calls for a nationwide mask mandate.
He wants to shut down our economy, close our schools, and grind society to a halt. And he wants it done by a federal decree.
What Joe Biden said was that every governor should mandate mask wearing.
Every single American should be wearing a mask when they're outside for the next 3 months at a minimum.
Speaking after a Thursday briefing from health and economic officials, the first one of his regular virtual briefings, also attended by running mate Kamala Harris.
That's what real leadership looks like. We just witnessed real leadership.
The president accuses the presumptive Democratic nominee of disregarding the different circumstances in different states.
Biden's approach is regressive, it's anti-scientific, and it's very defeatist, but it'll be very bad for our country.
And politicizing the virus.
While Joe Biden has been playing politics from the sidelines, he has no clue.
In a new Fox News poll, 85% of voters remain concerned about the virus spreading. More than half think the government's response wasn't serious enough. And on the virus and several other major issues, they trust Joe Biden to do a better job by double digits, giving President Trump a 3-point edge on the economy. Overall, Biden has a 7-point national lead in the Fox News poll, slightly lower than July's 8-point advantage and down from a 12-point spread in June. The poll was taken this week, but it's too soon to gauge the impact of Senator Harris as Biden's running mate.
Kamala Harris clearly adds some excitement to the ticket.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
I do think, in general, the enthusiasm issue is overplayed. When you ask Trump and Biden supporters, are you enthusiastic for the person you support? Trump vastly beats Biden in terms of people who are enthusiastic about the person they're voting for. But when you ask them, how strongly do you feel about the person you're opposing, Biden vastly beats Trump. In other words, there's tremendous anti-Trump feeling among Biden supporters. And in the end, I'm not sure it matters. If you're enthusiastically going to the polls to vote for one candidate or against another, they still count as votes.
Well, and I guess, another question is dislike of the president enough to get the Democrats over the finish line if that's the main motivator?
Absolutely. I'm not saying it will be, but do I think that, particularly when a candidate is the incumbent and running for re-election, the choice is often a referendum. It's less about Trump versus Clinton when they're both running for the same office and neither holds it. To a certain degree, this is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. How did he handle the coronavirus? How did he handle the economy? And, if people think that he hasn't handled it well and they have some belief in some modicum of belief in that Biden and Harris would do a better job, that can be enough to get him elected. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be.
The weekly unemployment claims finally came in under 1 million for the first time in 5 months. But the U.S. also just had the highest number of coronavirus deaths in a single day since May. So does it feel still like a real uphill battle? And the longer that goes on, it can't be good for the president, right?
Absolutely. Well, look, I don't think people are going to blame the president for the virus. One of the shots that Kamala Harris took on Wednesday against the president.
He inherited the longest economic expansion in history from Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And then, like everything else he inherited, he ran it straight into the ground. The president didn't drive the economy into the ground. The virus did. Having said that, people are going to make a judgment, given this horrible thing that was not the president's fault. Has he handled it well or has he handled it badly? And there's no reason to believe. I understand the number of cases are down from their high point in some of the hot spots like Florida and Texas and Arizona, but there's no reason to believe that we're done with the virus or that we're even close to being done with the virus. And if it can continue to flare up in places at various points, and I think school is a real, trouble spot. I can understand the arguments for sending kids back to school. I can understand also the concerns about sending kids back to school. You could get a flare up of the virus again, and that could have an impact on the economy as it has since March.
And Democrats seem to be trying to make the leap, if you will, and say, if his handling of the pandemic had been better, then the economic hit wouldn't have been so bad. So, blaming him from that standpoint.
I think that's an argument you can make. I mean, I think the argument would be that we haven't had a national plan, and had there been more of whether it can be imposed legally or whether it's simply the bully pulpit of the president, if he had set some markers earlier. I mean, I remember the day, I forget whether it was in March or April, when the CDC, I think it was in April, first came out and said, we think everybody should wear masks. And the first words out of the president's mouth were, I'm not going to wear a mask. And at a certain point, it almost became a sign of being too far to the left or politically correct to wear a mask, something the president doesn't say anymore. I think you can argue that had we pushed for some of the restrictions, for instance, that we had in New York, where the virus is very much down. I mean, it's one of the best places in the country in terms of the virus. They went through a terrible time, but they really cracked down on it. Had we not opened too soon in some places, maybe the virus would be under more control, and therefore the economic impact would not have been as steep.
What about the fight over another relief package? The way those talks stalled and the blame game, is one side more in danger with voters than the other for that?
I don't know, but as far as I'm concerned, Lisa, it's sort of, for me, it's a pox on both their houses. I mean, here's a case where the country is in such desperate shape. You've got millions of people who are unemployed. They've now lost the $600 benefit, and there's some question as to whether they're going to get a $300 benefit, and if so, how soon. Small businesses, the PPP, the payroll protection program money has run out. Eviction protections have run out. You got millions of people who are really going to suffer because of this. And, I'm less interested in is it more the Democrats' fault or more the Republicans' fault? But wouldn't you think that somewhere between $1 trillion, which is what the Republicans are offering, and $3 trillion, which is what the Democrats want, wouldn't you think that somewhere in between $1 and $3 trillion, you could arrive at some figure that would help people in trouble and be the half loaf, more than the Republicans want, less than the Democrats want. So I blame them all. I think it really stinks.
The president went on Fox Business Thursday morning, and he actually blamed the stalemate, at least in part, on the Democrats wanting billions of dollars for mail-in voting and the post office.
Now, they need that money in order to have the post office work so it can take all of these millions and millions of ballots.
A lot of voters are scared, though. I mean, could his continued criticism of that backfire?
Well, potentially. It's one of the concerns I know that Republicans in the states have, that if you keep saying there's a problem with mail-in voting and you shouldn't mail-in vote, the Democrats will mail-in vote and Republicans won't, and it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy in some of these states, not just in the presidential race, but also in state races. I think there is a real danger of that, and I don't know that that's really, when you think of what we're talking about here, $1 trillion or $3 trillion, the kind of money that they're talking about for mail-in voting and more money for the post office, I think it's like 25 or 30 billion, which is a lot of money, but not in the context of 2 or 3 trillion. One of the much bigger issues is aid to cities and states, where Republicans want it to be 150 billion and Democrats want 900 billion. That is a much bigger issue.
The president keeps calling attention, too, to the violent protests and the looting still happening in some cities around the country, most often cities with Democratic mayors, he's quick to note. And he's even saying, look, you'll get more of this now if you elect Biden and Harris, even as he seems to be trying to keep more focus on the virus at the same time. I mean, is this becoming, a competing narrative at this point?
No, I mean, I think that it's a perfectly legitimate issue for the president to bring up, and a concern. People want to see things running well, and to the degree that they're not seeing it in the virus or the economy, and maybe they blame that more on Republicans than Democrats. But on the other hand, they look at the disorder in the streets, and blame that on Democrats more than Republicans, I think that's a fair subject for the president to bring up. I know some of the protesters, when people start looting in some of these cities like Portland, say, hey, you're just helping Trump doing it. You know, that video every morning on the news, here's what happened overnight in Portland or Seattle or Chicago or New York. It upsets and energizes a lot of people, and you could understand, obviously, the Trump base, but even perhaps some swing voters who'll say, well, man, I don't want to have that going on in cities. And, you know, I'm not sure how fair it is to tie it to Biden or Kamala Harris, but, you know, I think it's a perfectly legitimate issue for Republicans to bring up.
I don't know if he's going to settle on one nickname for Kamala Harris. A lot of adjectives have come from the president and his campaign so far: phony, nasty, mean. Do you think nicknames will be effective this time around?
Well, I don't know that it changes any minds. You know, the Trump base is pretty strong, and they will love it. You know, but I mean, it's a little bit. I think in politics there's a little bit of leeway. It's like Kamala Harris saying that the president drove the economy into the ground, when obviously it was the virus that drove the economy into the ground. But, you know, the nicknames help. The one that I think, and I don't know whether voters are going to care about it, but I do think that, you know, looking and becoming a little bit more of a student of Harris's record, you know, there were certainly inconsistencies, and she was more moderate, more mainstream as the Attorney General in California. And then when she came to Washington as a senator and started running for president almost immediately, she moved to the left. There's no question about that, because that's where the balance of power in the Democratic Party is now. And you can see some flips on decisions. You could see some flips on decisions even during the campaign, like Medicare for All. So I think that's something that we're going to have to explore. You know, her candidacy for the vice presidency is only 2 days old, but as people dig into that record, they're going to find some stuff.
Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. Don't miss it. And thank you very much, Chris, for your time.
You bet. Thank you, Lisa.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
This week's good news comes from a church in New Orleans. The folks at the Redeemer Presbyterian Church have gone viral for their sanctuary's social distancing reminders. In order to keep people a safe space apart during the pandemic, church officials taped signs to some of the wooden pews to make sure parishioners knew they shouldn't sit there. And instead of saying reserved or don't sit here, they got creative. They added some humor mixed in with some faith teaching, and the results are unforgettable. Printed on a sheet of paper held to the end of the pew with blue tape are signs that reference scripture, like, I have prepared a place for you. Then underneath those words it says, just not this pew. Another says, Jesus sat the 5,000 down in rows, just not in this one. Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore tree to get a better view. This pew was not it. You will find me when you seek me, just not in this pew. Keep seeking. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and if he were here today, he still wouldn't be allowed to sit in this pew. A post about the silly signs on the church's Facebook page has had more than 4,500 likes. Church officials say some of the quips were borrowed from others and some are originals, and they help in their effort to keep attendance under 100 instead of the 1,000 they could accommodate. The pandemic also means masks are worn during services and there's less singing. Like many churches, Redeemer live streams its services and posts video online for those who are staying home, and told WDSU-TV that they're, quote, glad we are not alone in this journey. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Guy Benson. What's on your mind?
Following roughly 2 consecutive months of nightly riots in Portland, Oregon, city and state officials, uniformly Democrats, placed blame on the Trump administration and federal law enforcement officers operating in the city. That presence was largely concentrated around protecting a federal courthouse that Antifa members and rioters had been attempting to burn down for weeks. An agreement was worked out for the feds to withdraw and reduce their presence, with local and state officials stepping up. That should stop the chaos, right? Wrong. The riots have continued. They've been disruptive and violent, with agitators attempting to set fire to police precincts. Even the left-wing mayor called this attempted murder.
We're going to burn their building down!
Threats and intimidation. This is not about Black Lives Matter. This is not about social justice or reform. It's violent agitation, and it's unacceptable. This is Guy Benson, host of The Guy Benson Show.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.